The New Mexico sun beat down with an unforgiving intensity, baking the dust into a fine ochre powder that clung to everything. It was a landscape of stark beauty, of vast open skies and rugged terrain, a place where resilience was not a choice, but a necessity. In this crucible of light and heat, a man named Eli stood, his weathered face a roadmap of years spent under that same relentless sun. He was a rancher, a respected figure in the small, close-knit community of Adobe Creek, a man whose word was as solid as the adobe walls of his homestead. He understood the land, its rhythms, its demands, and the unspoken contracts that governed life and livelihood within its unforgiving embrace. His world was one of tangible realities, cattle to tend, fences to mend, the predictable cycle of seasons. Yet even in this seemingly immutable existence, the undercurrent of human frailty, of choices made and consequences faced, always simmered just beneath the surface. The town square, usually a place of familiar bustle, held a different kind of energy that day. An auction was in progress, a common enough event, a place where fortunes could be made or lost on the turn of a gavel. But this auction was different, tinged with a darkness that Eli, in his quiet way, had always sought to keep at bay. It was here, amidst the cacophony of bids and the expectant faces of his neighbors, that Eli's ordinary world was irrevocably shattered. His gaze, usually steady and observant, fixed upon a young woman standing on the auction block. She was not livestock, not a piece of property to be bartered. Her eyes, wide and filled with a palpable, raw terror, were the eyes of someone utterly broken, someone stripped of agency, a soul trapped in a body that was being sold. The air crackled with an unspoken transaction, a league of human souls trading in a commodity that defied the very principles Eli held dear. The sight was a visceral blow, a stark affront to the quiet dignity he believed every life possessed. A hush fell over the crowd, a pregnant pause that hung in the hot air. Eli watched, his heart a heavy stone in his chest. The bids rose, a relentless tide of avarice, each one a hammer blow against the woman's already shattered spirit. And then it was his turn, his silence a deafening roar against the prevailing madness. He did not bid, he could not. The very act of participating felt like a betrayal, a tacit endorsement of the unspeakable. His refusal was not born of a lack of funds, nor of disinterest, but from a profound, unyielding moral conviction that some things were beyond price, beyond the transactional nature of commerce. In that single, quiet act of defiance, Eli, the respected rancher, became Eli, the pariah. The scornful glares, the muttered condemnations, the sharp, cutting words that followed him as he turned away from the auction block were not mere expressions of disapproval. They were the pronouncements of a community that had chosen a different path, a path paved with the currency of conformity and blind self-interest. The consequences of his silent protest were swift and brutal. The bonds of camaraderie that had defined his place in Adobe Creek frayed and snapped. He was shunned, his presence an unwelcome reminder of their own complicity, their own silence. The whispers followed him like a persistent shadow, branding him weak, a fool, a man who had lost his nerve, his sense of practical reality. The very people who had once lauded his strength now saw only his perceived failure. His isolation was absolute, a self-imposed exile that mirrored the vast, empty spaces of the New Mexico landscape. He retreated to his ranch, the familiar solitude now imbued with a new, sharper edge of alienation. The land, which had always been a source of solace, now seemed to echo the silence of the town, a silent witness to his ostracization. Yet, within this enforced quietude, a different kind of understanding began to dawn, a deeper awareness of the invisible currents that flowed beneath the surface of human interaction, currents that the town, in its haste to condemn, had failed to perceive. Then a subtle shift, almost imperceptible at first, began to stir. The air itself seemed to hum with a nascent energy, a whisper on the wind that carried a promise of something extraordinary. It was a feeling, a premonition that defied rational explanation, a palpable change that settled over the land like a shroud of anticipation. The oppressive heat of the day seemed to soften, the harsh glare of the sun tempered by an unseen force. Eli, attuned to the nuances of his environment, felt it deeply. It was as if the very earth was holding its breath, waiting. The familiar scent of sagebrush and dry earth was overlaid with something else, something wild and untamed, a scent that spoke of ancient power and silent covenants. This burgeoning sense of wonder, this quiet stirring of the extraordinary, was the harbinger of a transformation that would soon unfold, a testament to the unseen forces that shape destinies when human judgment falters. The following dawn painted the eastern sky with hues of rose and gold, a gentle awakening that belied the spectacle about to unfold. Eli, rising with the first light, stepped out onto his porch, the familiar routine of his morning interrupted by a sight that stole his breath. His isolated ranch, usually a solitary outpost against the vast expanse, was no longer alone. Encircling his homestead, as if summoned from the very fabric of the pre-dawn mist, stood 100 wild horses. They were a breathtaking vision, their coats shimmering in the nascent light, their powerful forms exuding an aura of untamed freedom and raw, elemental grace. They stood in silent reverence, a living, breathing testament to an unseen force, a silent judgment on the superficial values that had so recently condemned him. Their presence was inexplicable, a miracle woven into the fabric of the land, a profound mystery that spoke a truth Eli had long understood, that acts of courage, born of deep conviction, possess a power that transcends the quantifiable worth of any earthly price, a truth the town had been too blind, too bound by convention to see. The town, alerted by the impossible sight, descended upon Eli's ranch in a stunned, disbelieving throng. The outrage and scorn of the previous day had evaporated, replaced by a collective, stunned silence. The spectacle of the wild horses, a phenomenon that defied logic and defied their narrow understanding of the world, rendered them speechless. They had judged Eli for his refusal to participate in a transaction they deemed practical, a refusal they had branded as weakness. Now, faced with this inexplicable manifestation of power and grace, their condemnation crumbled into awe. The silent gathering of the herd was a profound mystery, a living parable that revealed a truth Eli had always known, that true strength lay not in conforming to the expectations of others, but in adhering to the quiet dictates of one's own conscience, even when standing alone. The horses, a symbol of untamed spirit and inherent worth, were a silent testament to the profound, unquantifiable value of his stand, a truth that resonated far beyond the dusty confines of Adobe Creek. The New Mexico sun, a relentless disk in the azure sky, beat down on the parched earth, the heat radiating in shimmering waves from the cracked soil. In the small, dusty town of Adobe Creek, life moved to a predictable, unhurried rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the age-old traditions of ranching. Eli, a man whose life was as deeply etched into the landscape as the arroyos carved by flash floods, was a pillar of this community. His ranch, a spread of sun-bleached wood and sturdy corrals, was a testament to decades of hard work and quiet integrity. He understood the harsh beauty of this land, its unforgiving nature, and the resilience it demanded of those who called it home. His reputation was built not on boisterous pronouncements, but on the quiet strength of his character, a strength that had earned him the respect of his neighbors, a respect that felt as solid and enduring as the mesas that guarded the horizon. The town square, usually a place of casual greetings and familiar faces, throbbed with a different energy that day. An auction was underway, a common occurrence, yet this one carried an undercurrent of unease, a subtle discord that Eli, with his keen sensitivity to the unspoken, could feel in the very air. His gaze, usually sharp and focused on the practicalities of livestock and land, was drawn against his will to the center of the gathering. There, on a makeshift platform, stood a young woman. She was not an animal for sale, not a piece of equipment to be bid upon. Her eyes, wide and luminous, held a depth of terror that was both profound and deeply unsettling, a silent scream trapped behind a veil of fear. The scene was a stark violation of the natural order, a transaction that spoke of ownership and subjugation, a commodification of a human soul that struck Eli to his core. The murmurs of the crowd, the rising cadence of bids, all faded into a dull roar as he confronted this agonizing tableau, the stark reality of an injustice laid bare beneath the indifferent sun. This was not merely an auction, it was a crucible, a moment that would test the very foundations of Eli's beliefs. The woman's silent plea, etched in the terrified depths of her eyes, was a call to action, an undeniable summons that resonated with a force far greater than any shouted bid. It was the inciting incident that would irrevocably shatter the quiet equilibrium of his ordinary world, leaving him with no choice but to confront the darkness that had infiltrated the heart of his community. The air grew heavy, charged with an unspoken question, a challenge directed not just at Eli, but at the collective conscience of Adobe Creek. The fragility of his established life, the comfortable certainty of his place within the community, was suddenly exposed, vulnerable to the disruptive power of a single moral imperative. The stage was set for a journey that would lead him far beyond the familiar boundaries of his ranch into the uncharted territory of his own courage and conviction. The scorn that followed Eli as he turned away from the auction was a palpable force, a wave of condemnation that threatened to engulf him. The town, so quick to embrace him in times of shared prosperity, now cast him out with a ferocity that bordered on the fanatical. Their words, sharp and cutting, painted him as a weakling, a man devoid of practical sense, a dreamer who had lost his grip on the harsh realities of their world. He was branded as an outcast, his respected status dissolving like mist under the midday sun. The isolation was profound, a chasm opening between him and the community he had once called home. His isolated ranch, once a sanctuary, now felt like a prison, the silence amplifying the sting of their judgment. Every creak of the wind, every rustle of the dry grass seemed to carry the echoes of their derision, a constant reminder of his perceived failure. Eli's initial response was a profound internal struggle, a wrestling with the very impulses that had led him to this precipice. The refusal of the call, the inherent human desire to avoid conflict and ostracization, warred with the unwavering conviction that had compelled his action. Doubt gnawed at him, whispering insidious questions about his own judgment, his own strength. Had he misread the situation? Had he succumbed to an emotional impulse, abandoning reason and practicality? The weight of their collective disapproval pressed down on him, a heavy mantle of shame and loneliness. He found himself questioning the very foundations of his beliefs, the core values that had always guided him. The path he had chosen, the path of moral integrity, was proving to be a desolate and solitary one, devoid of the comfort and camaraderie he had once taken for granted. Yet, even in his darkest moments of doubt, a flicker of resilience remained, a stubborn refusal to be extinguished. It was a quiet strength, born not of defiance, but of an unshakable inner truth. It was during this period of intense introspection, of grappling with his own vulnerabilities, that an unexpected source of guidance emerged. It wasn't a person, nor a tangible object, but a subtle shift in his perception, an intuitive understanding that seemed to emanate from the very land around him. It was as if the ancient wisdom of the New Mexico desert, the silent resilience of the flora and fauna that had adapted to survive in its harsh embrace, began to speak to him. This was his mentor, not in the traditional sense, but an embodiment of the enduring spirit of survival and quiet strength, offering him a unique perspective, a deeper understanding of the forces at play, and a subtle reassurance that his path, though difficult, was not without its own profound form of validation. The ostracization Eli faced was more than just social exclusion. It was a profound alteration of his very existence within Adobe Creek. The town, once a familiar tapestry of interconnected lives, had become a hostile territory. His isolation was absolute, the silence of his neighbors a deafening indictment. This period of intense scrutiny and judgment served as a brutal, yet necessary catalyst for a deeper transformation. It stripped away the superficial layers of societal approval, forcing him to confront the core of his own convictions. He began to see the town not as a unified entity, but as a collection of individuals, each bound by their own fears and desires, their own capacity for both cruelty and perhaps eventual understanding. This realization, a painful but illuminating insight, fundamentally shifted his perspective on the nature of community and the true meaning of belonging. The turning point arrived not with a dramatic event, but with a quiet internal shift, a moment of profound clarity that irrevocably altered his path. It was the dawning realization that his refusal to bid, his stand against the prevailing injustice, was not a failure, but an act of profound courage. He understood that true strength lay not in conforming to the expectations of a community blinded by greed, but in upholding the inherent dignity of every individual, regardless of their circumstances. This understanding marked his crossing the threshold, a commitment to a new way of being, a path that led away from the familiar comforts of societal acceptance and towards a deeper, more authentic connection with his own moral compass. He was entering a new and unfamiliar world, one where his values would be tested not by external judgment, but by the internal resolve required to live by them, with no possibility of turning back. This commitment was not a passive acceptance of his fate, but an active embrace of his newfound understanding. He began to see his isolation not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to reconnect with the land on a deeper level, to draw strength from its enduring resilience. He found solace in the quiet solitude of his ranch, in the predictable cycles of nature that offered a contrast to the chaotic and often irrational behavior of men. His focus shifted from seeking the approval of others to cultivating his own inner fortitude. The choices he had made, the difficult path he had chosen, had irrevocably changed him, setting him on a trajectory that would ultimately reveal a truth far more profound than the shallow judgments of his former community. He was no longer merely a rancher. He was a man tested and transformed, ready to face whatever the unfolding future might bring. The consequences of Eli's moral stand continued to unfold with a relentless, almost brutal honesty. His isolation deepened, the townspeople's ostracization a constant gnawing presence. They saw his solitary existence as proof of his weakness, his inability to navigate the complex social and economic currents of Adobe Creek. This period served as a crucible, forcing Eli to confront his deepest fears and grapple with complex moral dilemmas that extended beyond the initial auction. He had to navigate a world where his actions were constantly scrutinized, his motives questioned, and his very character assailed. The fragility of the core values he held dear was laid bare, tested by the persistent pressure to conform, to apologize, to somehow reintegrate into a community that had so readily cast him aside. The tension in his life escalated, not through overt conflict, but through the pervasive atmosphere of disapproval and the subtle acts of exclusion. The simple act of purchasing supplies became a trial, the shopkeeper's averted gazes and curt responses a constant reminder of his pariah status. He faced the temptation to compromise, to soften his stance, to perhaps offer a veiled apology that might ease the burden of his isolation. Yet each time this temptation arose, he found himself drawn back to the memory of the young woman's terrified eyes, a silent anchor that held him fast to his convictions. He realized that to yield would be to betray not only her, but the very essence of his own being. This internal battle, fought in the quiet solitude of his ranch, was the true test, a relentless pressure cooker that forged his resolve. During this challenging period, Eli found himself encountering a series of unexpected allies, individuals who, like him, existed on the fringes of Adobe Creek society, or who possessed a quiet understanding of the deeper currents of human decency. These were not the powerful or the influential, but ordinary people who recognized the quiet strength in Eli's stand. They offered small gestures of support, a nod of solidarity, a shared word of encouragement, a discreet act of kindness. These encounters, though subtle, provided crucial moments of affirmation, reminding him that he was not entirely alone. Simultaneously, he encountered adversaries, not in the form of outright enemies, but individuals who, driven by their own insecurities or a desperate need to conform, actively perpetuated the narrative of his weakness and foolishness. These were not purely malevolent figures, but reflections of the town's collective fear and its adherence to a rigid, unyielding code of conduct. The silent gathering of the wild horses was the culmination of Eli's trials, a decisive moment where the unseen forces he had sensed began to manifest in a way that defied all rational explanation. It was a profound revelation, a living testament to the power of his conviction. The 100 horses, standing sentinel around his isolated ranch, were not merely a spectacle. They were a profound affirmation, a visual representation of an unseen force that had responded to his act of courage. Their presence was a cathartic climax, a powerful counterpoint to the scorn and condemnation he had endured. This was the approach to the inmost cave, the moment of ultimate confrontation, not with an external enemy, but with the profound mystery of the universe itself, a moment that built unbearable suspense and anticipation. The ordeal was not a physical battle, but a profound existential experience. As Eli stood before the silent, majestic herd, he was confronted with the sheer magnitude of the event, the inexplicable nature of their appearance. It was a moment of overwhelming awe, a confrontation with forces that transcended human understanding. In that stillness, he experienced a profound sense of connection, not just to the horses, but to something larger, something ancient and enduring. This was the central crisis, a moment of deep introspection where he faced his ultimate fear, the possibility that his actions were indeed as foolish and misguided as his neighbors believed. But in the silent, unwavering gaze of the wild horses, he found his answer. Their presence was a validation, a confirmation that his adherence to his principles had resonated with a deeper truth, a truth that transcended the narrow confines of human judgment. The reward, seizing the sword, was not a tangible object but a profound, hard-won understanding. Eli gained an unshakable conviction in the inherent worth of his actions, a realization that true courage lay in standing for what is right, even when alone. He understood that the horses, appearing as if from nowhere, were a symbol of an unseen force, a testament to the fact that certain acts of integrity possess a power that the material world cannot comprehend. He had seized a deeper truth, a profound insight into the interconnectedness of all living things and the silent strength that arises from unwavering moral conviction. The culmination of his trials was not in the acquisition of wealth or status, but in the profound transformation of his inner world, a hard-won triumph that resonated with the timeless wisdom of the land. The dawn, that brought the wild horses also brought a profound, irreversible change to Eli and to Adobe Creek. The townspeople, rendered speechless by the inexplicable spectacle, were forced to confront the limitations of their own judgment. The scorn they had so readily heaped upon Eli dissolved in the face of this undeniable mystery. They saw not a fool, but a man who had somehow, inexplicably, been touched by something extraordinary. The aftermath of the horse's appearance was a period of quiet contemplation for the community, a time of reckoning with their own haste and their misplaced priorities. Eli, though no longer the active pariah, remained somewhat apart, his experience having irrevocably set him on a different path. He carried the quiet dignity of one who had faced adversity and emerged with a deeper understanding of himself and the world. The lingering consequences of the events were subtle but significant. Eli's isolation, while lessened, was never fully erased. He had crossed a threshold, and there was no returning to his former place within the community's unquestioning embrace. However, he had gained a new form of respect, a quiet reverence from those who had witnessed the inexplicable. His ranch, once a symbol of his isolation, now became a place of quiet contemplation, a testament to his resilience. He found a deeper connection with the land, drawing strength from its enduring presence. The scars of his ostracization remained, not as wounds, but as reminders of the profound lessons learned, of the inner fortitude he had discovered. He had learned that true strength was not about outward appearances or the approval of others, but about the unwavering adherence to one's own principles, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. This period marked the road back, not in the sense of a physical journey, but as a metaphorical return to a semblance of ordinary life, albeit a life fundamentally altered. Eli continued his ranching duties, his days filled with the familiar tasks of tending to his land and animals, yet he did so with a new perspective, a quiet wisdom that permeated his every action. He was no longer seeking validation, but simply living in accordance with his deepest truths. The persistence of struggle, he understood, was an inherent part of life, but he had found the inner resources to navigate its challenges with grace and resilience. His journey had not ended with the appearance of the horses. It had merely entered a new phase, one of quiet strength and enduring purpose, a testament to the ongoing nature of growth and the enduring power of the human spirit. The appearance of the wild horses around Eli's ranch left an indelible mark on Adobe Creek, a phenomenon that transcended the ordinary and planted seeds of profound change. The town, once so quick to judge and condemn, was rendered humbled, its collective certainty shaken by the inexplicable. The silent gathering of 100 untamed creatures, a living testament to an unseen force, served as a powerful catalyst for introspection, forcing the community to re-examine their values and their understanding of courage. Eli, once an outcast, became a quiet symbol of a different kind of strength, a testament to the idea that some acts of integrity possess a power that defies tangible measurement. His legacy was not one of grand pronouncements or public acclaim, but of a quiet, enduring truth that resonated in the hearts of those who had witnessed the unfolding mystery. The conclusion offered a resonant closure to the narrative, yet it left a lasting and profound impression. The wild horses, their purpose seemingly fulfilled, eventually dispersed, melting back into the vast New Mexico landscape as mysteriously as they had appeared. But their presence had awakened something within the community, a flicker of awareness that transcended their previous materialism and conformity. The subtle reinforcement of the central themes, the inherent worth of every individual, the power of quiet courage, and the existence of forces beyond human comprehension was woven into the very fabric of the town's collective memory. The message was not delivered through explicit statements, but through the shared experience, the lingering awe, and the quiet contemplation that followed. Eli, forever changed by his ordeal, returned to his ranch, bringing with him not a physical elixir, but a profound inner transformation. He had faced his deepest fears, confronted the limitations of his community, and emerged with an unwavering conviction in the power of his own moral compass. His resurrection was a spiritual one, a rebirth into a deeper understanding of himself and his place in the world. He had learned that true strength lay not in conforming to societal expectations, but in adhering to the quiet dictates of one's own conscience, even when standing alone. His return with the elixir was the quiet wisdom he now embodied, a testament to the enduring power of integrity, a gift that had the potential to subtly transform those who were open to its quiet, profound influence, leaving them with a sense of hope, inspiration, and a deeper understanding of the human condition. The quiet dignity Eli cultivated after the auction was not a passive resignation, but an active cultivation of inner fortitude, a deliberate redirection of his focus away from the town's judgment and towards the enduring truths of his own existence. Consider how this manifests when you face a personal setback, a professional disappointment that leaves you feeling adrift. Instead of dwelling on the perceived failures or the opinions of others who might readily dismiss your efforts, the principle here is to pivot your attention inward. Now, think about the subtle ways Eli began to draw strength from the land. He didn't just see the desert as a backdrop. He observed the tenacious grip of the creosote bush, its ability to thrive with minimal water, its resilience in the face of scorching heat. This wasn't mere observation. It was an internalization of a survival strategy. A quiet lesson in enduring hardship by adapting, by finding sustenance where others saw only barrenness. Furthermore, this period revealed a nuanced understanding of community that transcended the superficial bonds of Adobe Creek. While the town had ostracized him, Eli began to recognize that genuine connection wasn't necessarily about shared proximity or common interests, but about a deeper resonance of spirit. He encountered individuals whose quiet acts of kindness, though small, spoke volumes. These were not grand gestures of solidarity, but subtle acknowledgements of shared humanity, a knowing glance from a passing stranger, a brief, encouraging word from a fellow rancher who perhaps harbored his own silent doubts about the town's prevailing sentiment. Building on this, however, it's crucial to understand that Eli didn't actively seek these connections. Rather, he cultivated an openness, a receptivity to the possibility of genuine human connection that existed beyond the clamor of public opinion. Consequently, his engagement with his daily tasks took on a new dimension. It wasn't just about maintaining his ranch. It was about reinforcing his own sense of purpose and self-reliance. Each mended fence, each herd counted, became a reaffirmation of his capabilities, a tangible demonstration of his competence that required no external validation. Imagine yourself in a situation where your skills are being questioned or overlooked. The lesson here is to channel that energy into honing those very skills, into perfecting the craft, into finding satisfaction in the execution of the task itself, irrespective of recognition. Conversely, the town's focus on external validation, the bids at the auction, the outward show of prosperity, was precisely what had blinded them to the deeper currents of integrity. Eli, by contrast, found his validation in the quiet competence of his work, in the enduring strength of the land he stewards. Another crucial layer is the development of an internal compass that guides decisions independent of external pressures. Eli's refusal to bid was not an impulsive act, but the outward manifestation of a deeply ingrained moral framework. Consider how this applies when you face a difficult ethical choice in your own life, perhaps at work or within your family. The temptation might be to follow the path of least resistance, to align with the majority opinion, even if it feels wrong. However, The principle Eli embodies is the cultivation of a strong internal moral compass, a guiding set of principles that allows you to navigate complex situations with clarity and conviction. This isn't about stubbornness. It's about a profound self-awareness and a commitment to living in alignment with one's deepest values, even when that path is solitary and challenging. The subtle shifts in Eli's demeanor, stemming from his profound internal recalibration, began to manifest in his interactions with the natural world around his ranch. Consider how this applies when you find yourself in a period of personal introspection, perhaps after a significant disappointment that leaves you questioning your capabilities. Instead of succumbing to the inertia of self-doubt, Eli channeled his focus into a deeper communion with his surroundings. He didn't just see the vastness of the New Mexico sky. He began to perceive the intricate patterns of bird migration, the silent communication between the rustling grasses and the prevailing winds, the subtle shifts in soil moisture that signaled the impending arrival of rain. This wasn't mere observation, it was an active engagement with the environment, a silent dialogue that reinforced his connection to something larger than himself and his immediate circumstances. Building on this, however, it's crucial to understand that Eli's deepened connection wasn't a passive acceptance of his isolation. Rather, it was an active cultivation of self-sufficiency that extended beyond the practicalities of ranching. He started experimenting with more sustainable methods, developing a more intricate understanding of the delicate ecological balance of his land. Now consider how this applies when you're faced with a challenge that seems insurmountable, where external support is scarce. Eli's approach was to delve deeper into understanding the resources at his disposal, to innovate within his constraints, much like a desert plant developing deeper root systems to access hidden water sources. This focus on internal resourcefulness, on finding solutions within his own capacity and environment, became a quiet testament to his resilience, a stark contrast to the town's reliance on external transactions and collective approval. Furthermore, Eli's internal recalibration fostered a heightened awareness of the unspoken narratives that permeate human interaction. He began to discern the subtle anxieties and unspoken desires that motivated his neighbors, understanding their collective behavior not as malicious intent, but as a product of their own ingrained fears and societal pressures. For instance, consider how this applies when you encounter someone whose actions seem perplexing or even hostile. Instead of immediately reacting with judgment, try to observe the underlying currents, the potential unspoken motivations that might be driving their behavior. Eli's ability to perceive these subtle cues allowed him to navigate his ostracization with a degree of equanimity, understanding that their condemnation was a reflection of their own limitations, not a definitive judgment on his character. Conversely, his focus shifted from seeking external validation to cultivating an internal reservoir of self-worth. The town's relentless scrutiny had, paradoxically, served to strengthen his resolve. He no longer measured his success by the number of bids he received or the opinions of others. Instead, his achievements were measured by his adherence to his own principles, by the quiet integrity with which he conducted himself. Now think about how this applies when you're striving for a personal goal, perhaps learning a new skill or pursuing a creative endeavor. The temptation to seek constant external praise can be a significant distraction. Eli's experience suggests that true fulfillment comes from the intrinsic satisfaction of the process itself, from the dedication to mastery, and from the quiet knowledge that you are living in accordance with your own deeply held values, independent of external recognition. This internal locus of control became his most potent defense against the corrosive effects of societal disapproval. The period of Eli's ostracization, while intensely isolating, also served as a crucible for forging a profound understanding of self-reliance that extended beyond mere practical skills. Now consider how this applies when you're navigating a situation where external validation is conspicuously absent, perhaps during a period of personal growth where your progress isn't immediately apparent to others. Eli, stripped of the familiar affirmations of his community, began to internalize the process of achievement. His focus shifted from the outcome of his labor, the sale of cattle, the success of a season, to the intrinsic value of the labor itself. He found a deep satisfaction in the meticulous care of his animals, the quiet rhythm of his daily tasks, the sheer competence required to maintain his homestead against the harsh elements. This wasn't about defiance. It was about discovering a source of worth that was entirely self-generated, a wellspring of confidence independent of external applause. Building on this, however, it's crucial to recognize that this internal cultivation of self-worth didn't lead to a withdrawal from the possibility of connection, but rather to a more discerning approach to it. Eli's experience taught him that true camaraderie isn't built on shared conformity, but on a mutual respect for individual conviction. Think about how this applies when you're seeking genuine connection in a world that often prioritizes superficial similarities. Eli began to recognize individuals who demonstrated a quiet integrity, people who, like him, seemed to operate by their own internal compass. These weren't necessarily those who openly championed his cause, but individuals whose subtle actions, a shared glance of understanding, a brief moment of unforced kindness, hinted at a similar depth of character. His awareness expanded, allowing him to perceive the quiet currents of genuine human connection that flowed beneath the surface of societal expectations. Consequently, Eli's relationship with his environment deepened, transforming from one of stewardship to one of profound symbiosis. He began to anticipate the land's needs with an almost instinctual understanding, noticing subtle shifts in the wind that foretold weather changes, identifying edible plants that others overlooked, and understanding the complex interplay between the flora and fauna. Consider how this applies when you're facing a challenge where conventional solutions seem inadequate, forcing you to look for answers in unexpected places. Eli's deep attunement to his surroundings allowed him to perceive resources and opportunities that remained invisible to those less connected to the land. This wasn't about mastering nature, but about becoming a harmonious part of its intricate web, drawing strength and wisdom from its enduring cycles, a stark contrast to the town's more extractive relationship with the earth. Conversely, Eli's ostracization paradoxically sharpened his perception of the town's collective blind spots. He observed how their reliance on established norms and their fear of deviation prevented them from seeing the deeper truths he had come to understand. Think about how this applies when you witness a situation where a group's adherence to tradition seems to stifle progress or empathy. Eli saw that their condemnation of him stemmed not from a rational assessment of his actions, but from a fear of the unknown, a discomfort with anything that challenged their established worldview. This insight allowed him to detach from their judgment, understanding it as a reflection of their own limitations rather than a valid critique of his character. His isolation, therefore, became not a punishment, but a unique vantage point from which to observe the human condition with a clearer, more compassionate eye. The period of Eli's ostracization, while intensely isolating, also served as a crucible for forging a profound understanding of self-reliance that extended beyond mere practical skills. Now, consider how this applies when you're navigating a situation where external validation is conspicuously absent, perhaps during a period of personal growth where your progress isn't immediately apparent to others. Eli, stripped of the familiar affirmations of his community, began to internalize the process of achievement. His focus shifted from the outcome of his labor, the sale of cattle, the success of a season, to the intrinsic value of the labor itself. He found a deep satisfaction in the meticulous care of his animals, the quiet rhythm of his daily tasks, the sheer competence required to maintain his homestead against the harsh elements. This wasn't about defiance. It was about discovering a source of worth that was entirely self-generated, a wellspring of confidence independent of external applause. Building on this, however, it's crucial to recognize that this internal cultivation of self-worth didn't lead to a withdrawal from the possibility of connection, but rather to a more discerning approach to it. Eli's experience taught him that true camaraderie isn't built on shared conformity, but on a mutual respect for individual conviction. Think about how this applies when you're seeking genuine connection in a world that often prioritizes superficial similarities. Eli began to recognize individuals who demonstrated a quiet integrity, people who, like him, seemed to operate by their own internal compass. These weren't necessarily those who openly championed his cause, but individuals whose subtle actions, a shared glance of understanding, a brief, unforced kindness, hinted at a similar depth of character. His awareness expanded, allowing him to perceive the quiet currents of genuine human connection that flowed beneath the surface of societal expectations. Consequently, Eli's relationship with his environment deepened, transforming from one of stewardship to one of profound symbiosis. He began to anticipate the land's needs with an almost instinctual understanding, noticing subtle shifts in the wind that foretold weather changes, identifying edible plants that others overlooked, and understanding the complex interplay between the flora and fauna. Consider how this applies when you're facing a challenge where conventional solutions seem inadequate, forcing you to look for answers in unexpected places. Eli's deep attunement to his surroundings allowed him to perceive resources and opportunities that remained invisible to those less connected to the land. This wasn't about mastering nature, but about becoming a harmonious part of its intricate web, drawing strength and wisdom from its enduring cycles, a stark contrast to the town's more extractive relationship with the earth. Conversely, Eli's ostracization paradoxically sharpened his perception of the town's collective blind spots. He observed how their reliance on established norms and their fear of deviation prevented them from seeing the deeper truths he had come to understand. Think about how this applies when you witness a situation where a group's adherence to tradition seems to stifle progress or empathy. Eli saw that their condemnation of him stemmed not from a rational assessment of his actions, but from a fear of the unknown, a discomfort with anything that challenged their established worldview. This insight allowed him to detach from their judgment, understanding it as a reflection of their own limitations rather than a valid critique of his character. His isolation, therefore, became not a punishment, but a unique vantage point from which to observe the human condition with a clearer, more compassionate eye. Another crucial layer in Eli's transformation involved the development of an acute sensitivity to the subtle nuances of power dynamics. He began to recognize that the town's collective outrage wasn't purely about his perceived weakness, but also about the disruption he represented to their established social hierarchy. Consider how this applies when you find yourself challenging a long-held consensus, perhaps within a family or a workplace. Eli understood that his act of defiance, by refusing to participate in the auction, had implicitly questioned the authority of those who perpetuated such practices. This realization allowed him to approach his continued isolation with a different perspective. It wasn't just personal rejection, but a reaction to his implicit challenge to the status quo. He learned to navigate this subtle power struggle not through confrontation, but through an unwavering commitment to his own principles, thereby demonstrating a different form of influence, one rooted in moral conviction rather than social leverage. Eli's growing self-sufficiency began to manifest not merely in his ability to manage his ranch independently, but in a deeper, more intuitive understanding of cause and effect within his environment. Now, Consider how this applies when you're faced with a complex problem that seems to defy conventional analysis, forcing you to look beyond the obvious symptoms. Eli started to observe the subtle indicators of ecological health, the presence of specific insect populations, the vitality of native grasses, the patterns of water runoff after a storm. He learned to read these signs not as isolated data points, but as interconnected elements of a larger system. This wasn't about accumulating knowledge for its own sake. It was about developing a predictive capacity, an ability to anticipate challenges before they fully materialized. Much like a seasoned mariner reading the subtle shifts in wave patterns to predict an approaching squall, his self-reliance evolved into a form of environmental literacy, allowing him to adapt his practices proactively rather than reactively. Building on this, however, it's crucial to recognize that Eli's internal recalibration fostered a heightened awareness of the nuanced ways in which human actions ripple through a community, even in the absence of direct interaction. He began to understand that his solitary stand, while seemingly a personal act, had initiated a subtle but significant shift in the town's collective consciousness. Think about how this applies when you've made a decision that goes against the prevailing norm, and you're observing the indirect impact of that choice on those around you. Eli noticed how his quiet resilience, his refusal to be broken by their judgment, seemed to resonate with certain individuals who had previously remained silent. It wasn't an overt endorsement, but a subtle acknowledgement of a different way of being, a quiet inspiration that perhaps encouraged others to question their own complicity or their own unexamined beliefs. His isolation, therefore, paradoxically created a different kind of influence, one that operated on a more subliminal level. Consequently, Eli's relationship with his own past transformed, moving from a source of potential regret to a foundation for future action. He no longer dwelled on the moments that led to his ostracization, but instead viewed them as necessary experiences that had forged his current understanding. Consider how this applies when you reflect on past mistakes or difficult experiences that initially felt like failures. Eli learned to reframe these events not as definitive judgments on his character, but as crucial learning opportunities. He saw that the pain of his isolation had been the very catalyst for his deeper self-discovery, for his increased resilience, and for his refined perception of human nature. This perspective shift allowed him to move forward with a sense of purpose, unburdened by the weight of past grievances and instead empowered by the wisdom gained. Conversely, Eli's growing self-reliance also highlighted the limitations of purely individualistic strength. While he had learned to thrive in isolation, he also began to perceive the subtle ways in which interconnectedness, even in its most understated forms, contributes to collective well-being. Think about how this applies when you've achieved a significant personal goal, but you recognize that the broader context or the support systems, however subtle, played a role in your success. Eli observed how the natural world itself operated in a state of interdependence, how the pollination of certain plants relied on specific insects, how the health of the soil was dependent on the decomposition of organic matter. This realization wasn't about regretting his isolation, but about acknowledging that even the most self-sufficient entity exists within a larger ecosystem. This nuanced understanding informed his perspective on his place within the world, suggesting that true strength might also lie in recognizing and respecting these subtle, often unseen, interdependencies. Reflecting on this journey so far, we can perceive the intricate tapestry woven from Eli's quiet stand and its subsequent ripples through the arid landscape of Adobe Creek. The initial shock of his defiance, a solitary act against a tide of communal expectation, has given way to a deeper contemplation of the forces that shape individual conviction and societal response. It's not simply about a single decision made under the unforgiving sun, but about the profound internal shifts that such decisions engender, recalibrating one's very perception of worth and belonging. The subsequent isolation, initially a crushing burden, has paradoxically served as fertile ground for a more nuanced understanding of resilience and the quiet strength derived from an unassailable inner compass. The echoes of scorn have faded, replaced by a subtler awareness of the interconnectedness of actions and their far-reaching, often unseen consequences. As we pivot towards the final reflection, consider how the perceived fragility of deeply held values is, in fact, their greatest strength, revealed not in moments of ease, but in the crucible of adversity. The narrative has charted a course through the erosion of external validation and the subsequent discovery of an internal reservoir of purpose. This journey has illuminated the often unseen currents that guide human behavior, revealing how fear and conformity can blind even the most well-intentioned communities to fundamental truths. The challenge now lies in synthesizing these insights, in understanding how the quiet courage displayed in a single, defining moment can resonate and transform, much like a single pebble dropped into a vast lake, its ripples extending far beyond the initial point of impact. In light of these converging threads, the path forward becomes clearer, not in the sense of providing definitive answers, but in illuminating the profound questions that linger. The extraordinary manifestation that followed Eli's unwavering stance serves as a powerful metaphor for the universe's subtle responses to acts of genuine integrity. It speaks to a deeper order, a recognition of courage that transcends the limited scope of human judgment. The narrative has moved beyond the simple recounting of events to explore the enduring implications of living authentically, even when that path deviates sharply from the norm. The cumulative effect of these explorations points towards a profound understanding of how inner conviction, when held with unwavering resolve, possesses a transformative power that can reshape not only the individual, but the very fabric of their perceived reality. The transition now guides us toward appreciating the enduring legacy of such a journey, a legacy not measured in material gains or public accolades, but in the quiet recalibration of understanding and the subtle shifts in perspective that can ripple outwards. As we prepare to embrace the final takeaway, let us consider how the lessons learned from Eli's experience offer a timeless perspective on the nature of true strength, the unwavering value of principled action, and the often unseen forces that respond to a spirit unyielding in its commitment to what is right. This convergence of trials, revelations, and the subsequent quiet aftermath sets the stage for a concluding contemplation on the enduring resonance of a life lived with profound integrity. The dust settled, not just on the sun-baked earth of Adobe Creek, but within the collective consciousness of its people. Eli's quiet stand, initially met with derision and scorn, had become a silent testament to a truth far more enduring than the fleeting judgments of men. The spectacle of the wild horses, an inexplicable visitation that defied logic and shattered their ingrained assumptions, served as a profound, albeit wordless, sermon. It spoke of forces unseen, of a natural order that responded not to avarice or conformity, but to the quiet, unyielding integrity of the human spirit. The town, once so quick to condemn Eli for his refusal to engage in a transaction they deemed practical, was rendered speechless by the sheer, unquantifiable power of his conviction. Their scorn had been a reflection of their own limitations, their fear of anything that deviated from their established norms, and the horse's silent presence illuminated this truth with an irrefutable clarity. Eli's journey had been one of profound internal recalibration, a shedding of the need for external validation in favor of an unshakable inner certainty. Stripped of the familiar affirmations of his community, he had discovered a wellspring of self-reliance, not merely in the practical management of his ranch, but in the cultivation of a moral compass that guided him with unwavering precision. He learned to read the subtle language of the land, to find sustenance and wisdom in its enduring cycles, becoming a part of its intricate web rather than an exploiter of it. This deep attunement to his environment mirrored his growing understanding of human nature. He began to discern the unspoken anxieties and desires that motivated his neighbors, recognizing their actions not as malice, but as manifestations of their own ingrained fears and societal pressures. His isolation, therefore, became not a punishment, but a unique vantage point from which to observe the human condition with a clearer, more compassionate eye. The true resonance of Eli's story lies not in the extraordinary event itself, but in the quiet courage that preceded it. It is a reminder that the most profound transformations often begin with a single, unwavering act of conviction, a refusal to compromise one's core values even when faced with overwhelming opposition. The world, much like the New Mexico desert, often presents a stark and challenging landscape, testing the resilience of those who dare to tread a different path. Yet, as Eli's experience so powerfully illustrates, it is in these very trials that our deepest strengths are forged and our most profound truths are revealed. The legacy of his stand is not a tale of vindication, but a quiet testament to the enduring power of integrity, a silent invitation to listen to the whispers of our own conscience and to trust in the unseen forces that respond to a spirit unyielding in its commitment to what is right. The true practice begins now, to recognize the quiet courage within ourselves, to honor the integrity of our own convictions, and to understand that sometimes the most powerful stands are taken in the profound silence of our own choosing.